The widow fed a hungry monkey. The next morning, 100 monkeys invaded her land. She did not know it yet, but the animals shivering on her porch that night would either save the last thing she owned or take it from her forever. Before the story begins, a quick promise. Tonight you will meet a 62-year-old widow named Alistair, alone on a dying Virginia farm, and a single act of kindness toward one broken animal that no one asked her to help. By morning, that one act will bring 100 strangers to her fence line and a county inspector with a stopwatch counting down her last 72 hours. Stay until the end, because what those animals dig out of the ground will change who this land actually belongs to. If you are watching from your own porch tonight, drop your city in the comments. And if stories about the quiet kind of courage matter to you, hit like and subscribe before we start, because Alistair is about to open a door she has kept shut for 3 years. The valley holds its breath before the rain comes. It always has. Long before the highway cut through the ridge to the east, before the soy company bought out 4 of the 6 family farms along Route 9, the wind used to move differently through this hollow, curling low over the fescue instead of screaming straight down from the mountain the way it does now that the tree line has been shaved back on 3 sides. The old-timers who still remember say the land used to breathe. Now it mostly just waits. Alistair Whitfield's farmhouse sits at the end of that waiting, a gray clapboard structure with a sagging porch roof and a chimney that leans 2 degrees off true, visible from the county road if a person knows exactly where to look between the dead hedgerows. Most people don't look. For 3 years, most people have driven straight past the mailbox with her married name peeling off in flakes of white paint, past the gate that used to swing open for feed trucks and now stays chained shut except on the second Tuesday of the month when the propane man comes. She taught high school biology for 26 years, 1 county over, in a building that has since been renamed after a football coach nobody under 40 remembers. Her former students are middle-aged now, with mortgages and children of their own, and the ones who still recognize her in the grocery store tend to look away half a second too quickly, the way people do around something they are not sure how to categorize anymore. Widow. Recluse. The lady who used to be somebody. Her husband, Robert, ran cattle on 60 acres until his heart gave out in the equipment shed on a Thursday in March, 3 winters back, with a wrench still in his hand, and the radio playing a weather report for a storm that never arrived. Alistair found him 40 minutes later, when the coffee she'd brought out had already gone cold in the mug. She has not fully warmed a cup of coffee since without checking the window twice before she drinks it. What's left of the farm has shrunk the way things shrink when there is no longer a reason to keep them large. She sold the cattle within the year, unable to manage the herd alone and unwilling to hire the kind of help Robert used to trust with his eyes closed. Fields that once rotated through hay and grain now sit choked with broomsage and Queen Anne's lace, a slow green surrender visible from the ridge road above. The barn roof has a hole in the northeast corner that lets in enough light, on a clear afternoon, to throw a pale gold column onto the floorboards where Robert used to keep his saddle. Only one animal remains from what used to be a working farm. Zephyr, a Frisian gelding, 17 years old now, black as wet slate, with a mane that Robert used to braid before county fairs he no longer lives to attend. The horse stands most days at the far corner of his paddock, head low, barely grazing, turning in slow half circles as though searching for someone who left and did not say where he was going. Alistair feeds him because feeding him is a task with a beginning and an end, one of the last such tasks left to her. She does not talk to him the way she used to. There did not seem to be much left to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. Around her, the valley has been changing in a way she notices the way a person notices weather, present but abstract, something happening to the world rather than to her directly. 2 summers ago, a logging operation began clearing the ridge above Miller's Gap, 6 miles north, officially thinning for fire management, unofficially clean-cutting for a paper contract that pays better than corn ever did. The equipment noise carries down the hollow on still mornings, a distant mechanical groan that Alistair has learned to fold into the background the way she folds in the sound of her own refrigerator. She keeps to herself with a discipline that looks, from the outside, almost professional. Groceries twice a month, time for the slow hour before closing when the store is closer to empty. Church, abandoned quietly, without confrontation, sometime during the second winter, when the sympathy in people's eyes had curdled into something closer to impatience. a landline that rings maybe 4 times a month, mostly robocalls and the occasional check-in from a cousin in Roanoke who means well and asks the same 3 questions every time in the same worried order. On the evening this story actually begins, the sky over the valley turns a color that farmers around here have a private vocabulary for. The green-gray that means something worse than an ordinary storm is stacking up behind the ridge. Alistair notices it from the kitchen window while washing a single plate, a single fork, a single knife, the smallest possible collection of dishes a person can generate for herself. She sets the plate in the rack. She looks at the sky a beat longer than the sky requires. Then she goes out to bring in the porch chair cushions before the wind takes them. An unremarkable task. She has performed 100 storms in a row, with no way of knowing that tonight it will not stay unremarkable for long. The wind finds the valley first, hours before the rain does, funneling down off the ridge with a low sustained howl that rattles the loose pane in the mudroom window Robert always meant to reglaze. By 8 o'clock the sky has gone the color of a fresh bruise, and by 9 the first sheets of rain are coming in sideways hard enough to sound like gravel against the clapboard siding. Alistair moves through the house the way she moves through every storm now, checking latches out of habit rather than fear, lighting the 2 oil lamps on the kitchen counter because the power out here fails more often than it holds, and settling into the chair by the wood stove with a book she has read before and is not really reading now. The first sound she attributes to the storm, a scrape against the porch boards, easily explained by a loose shutter or a branch torn free somewhere overhead. The second sound is different enough that her hand stops on the page. Not the flat clatter of debris, something with weight behind it, deliberate in a way wind debris never is, followed by a silence that feels, even through 2 walls, like something holding still on purpose. She crosses to the window before she has fully decided to. The porch light, the one bulb on the whole exterior of the house still working, throws a weak circle onto the wet boards, and at the very edge of that circle, half in the light and half swallowed by the dark, something small and hunched is pressed against the porch post, not moving, soaked through to whatever passes for skin beneath fur that dark rain has plastered flat against a narrow frame. For a long moment neither the woman at the window nor the animal on the porch commits to anything. Alistair's grip on the curtain does not loosen. The shape outside does not retreat into the tree line the way any wild animal with functioning instincts would, given a door, a light, and a stranger on the other side of the glass. It simply stays where it is, one arm curled protectively against its own side in a way that reads, even from a distance and through warped old glass, as an animal in pain that has run out of better options. She recognizes the species before she consciously decides to look for it, the biology teacher in her surfacing before the widow does. A Capuchin, tufted, an old male by the gray dusting along its brow and the deep creases bracketing its face. An animal that has no reasonable business being in a Virginia hollow in the middle of a spring storm, for 100 miles north of anywhere a wild population of its kind should exist. Exotic pet trade, she thinks, or an escapee from one of the roadside menageries 2 counties over, or something stranger that she does not yet have the information to name. What she does next, she does slowly, the way a person moves around something that might bolt, or bite, or simply die if handled wrong. She unlatches the front door, and the wind takes it out of her hand hard enough to bang it against the wall, and the animal on the porch flinches at the sound, but does not run. It watches her instead, dark eyes catching the lamp light behind her, an expression that a cynic would insist is nothing but instinct, and a biologist who spent 26 years teaching children about the nervous systems of primates knows, with an old certainty she has not felt in a long time, is something closer to a calculation being made about whether this particular human, on this particular night, can be trusted. She stands in the doorway with the storm screaming past her shoulder and does not go back inside. The animal does not enter the house, not that night, not for the better part of an hour. It stays exactly where the porch light reaches, pressed into the narrow, dry margin under the eave where the rain cannot quite follow the wind sideways, and Alistair, after a long study of the injury along its ribs, a wound that looks less like a bite and more like the raw furrow a snare or a length of wire leaves behind, goes back inside and does the only thing that occurs to her as useful. She warms what is already on the stove. It is not much. A single stewed apple, cooked soft with the skin still on because she never bothers peeling for one person, and a heel of bread left from a loaf gone half stale. It was meant to be her own dinner, the whole of it, the modest ration of a woman who has stopped cooking for appetite and started cooking for obligation. She carries the plate out onto the porch anyway and sets it down at a careful distance, then retreats to the doorway, not quite inside, not quite out, and waits with a patience that has nowhere else to be spent tonight. The animal does not move for a long time. Then it does, in the particular way an injured creature moves when hunger finally outweighs caution, a low crouching approach that keeps its wounded side angled away from her, one hand extended toward the bread first, the safer offering, before it risks the apple. It eats without ceremony, without gratitude that a person could point to and name, simply the mechanical, focused consumption of something that has not eaten a full meal and longer than it should have gone. Rain keeps coming down around the porch light and silver ropes. Somewhere out past the paddock fence, Zephyr's shape is visible for a half second in a flash of lightning, standing at the rail with his head up, watching the porch instead of the storm. Alistair does not try to touch the animal. She has taught enough biology, buried enough of her own family, and lost enough of her own certainty about the world to know the difference between a gesture that helps and a gesture that only makes the helper feel better. She simply stays in the doorway, wrapped in a coat she never buttoned, until the plate is empty and the animal has folded itself into the dry corner of the porch where the wind cannot quite reach. And something in its posture, no longer braced, no longer coiled to run, tells her more clearly than words could that it intends, at least for tonight, to stay. She goes back inside sometime after midnight, when the rain has thinned from sheets to a steady drum, and she does not sleep the way she usually does not sleep, lying on her side of the bed with the other side still made the way Robert left it, listening to a house that has learned to be quiet around her. But there is a difference tonight in the quality of that listening. For the first time and longer than she could say with any precision, the silence outside her window is not entirely empty. By the time gray light starts leaking through the curtains, the storm has moved on, leaving the valley scrubbed and dripping, gutters overflowing and shortbright falls off the eaves, the yard littered with torn leaves and one broken branch from the sycamore near the drive. Alistair wakes earlier than the alarm she no longer bothers setting, some old instinct pulling her upright before her mind has fully caught up to why, and she is halfway into her robe before she remembers the shape on the porch, before the memory of last night resolves into something more urgent than a dream. She reaches the front window first. What she sees through it stops her hand flat against the glass. The porch is empty. The plate she left out is licked clean and pushed neatly against the post, undisturbed by wind, as though something took care not to knock it over. But it is not the empty porch that holds her still. It is what lies beyond it, past the porch rail, past the drive, all the way out to the paddock fence and the tree line beyond that, silent, motionless, and utterly wrong in a way her mind takes several full seconds to process correctly. The fence posts are lined with them. The barn roof carries a dozen more along its ridge. The lower branches of the old oaks past the paddock sag under a weight of small dark bodies, still and watchful, and more are seated in loose clusters across the wet grass itself, grooming each other with an unhurried calm that belongs to creatures who believe, for reasons they alone understand, that they have finally arrived somewhere safe. She does not need to count them precisely to know the number is close to 100. She only needs to stand at that window, coffee forgotten, heart working harder than the situation should reasonably require, to understand that what came to her in the storm last night was not one lost animal seeking shelter. It was a scout. Alistair does not go back to bed. She does not call anyone, not yet, though her hand hovers twice over the old rotary phone in the hallway before she pulls it back both times. Uncertain who exactly a person calls when their fence line has quietly filled overnight with 100 capuchin monkeys and no explanation has arrived to go with them. She dresses instead, boots and the barn coat, and steps out onto the porch the way a person steps into water of uncertain temperature, one careful movement at a time. The animals track her without alarm. A few of the nearest shift position, small adjustments rather than flight, the way a crowd parts slightly for someone walking through it without actually dispersing. She scans the fence rail, the barn roof, the low branches, looking for the one animal she would recognize among the rest, the gray-browed male from the porch, the deep gouge along his ribs. She finds him eventually, seated apart from the main cluster near the paddock gate, closer to Zephyr's fence than any of the others have bothered to come, watching the horse with the same still patience he showed her the night before. Zephyr has not retreated to the far corner of the paddock this morning. He stands at the rail instead, close enough that his breath fogs faintly in the cool morning air, ears forward, a posture Alistair has not seen from him since before Robert died. It is such a small thing, a horse simply standing somewhere different than usual, that she almost misses what it actually means, until she notices her own hand pressed flat against her chest, and realizes she has been holding her breath without deciding to. She does not have language yet for what this is. She only has the ordinary details in front of her, the wet grass flattened under 100 small bodies, the fence posts crowded shoulder to shoulder, the strange hush hanging over a farm that has not felt this occupied since Robert's funeral filled the drive with cars. Whatever brought them, whatever the old male's injury actually cost him to survive, whatever chain of events pushed an entire troop of monkeys out of wherever they belonged and down into this particular hollow on this particular night, she understands, standing on her own porch in the gray morning light, that it did not end with him. It only started with him. Somewhere past the ridge to the north, a logging crew is already at work, the distant grind of machinery carrying faintly down the hollow the way it has for 2 summers now, indifferent to the fact that below it, on a widow's forgotten 60 acres, an entire displaced population has just decided, overnight, without asking anyone's permission, that this quiet, half-abandoned farm is the only piece of ground left in the valley still worth calling safe. The phone in the hallway starts ringing before Alistair has finished her second cup of coffee. She almost doesn't answer it. In 3 years, the ringing has rarely meant anything she wanted to hear. And this morning, with the yard still full of watchful shapes, and her own understanding of the situation still forming in real time, she lets it go through 4 rings before finally lifting the receiver. The voice on the other end belongs to Del Ashby, who farms the parcel 2 properties over and has not spoken to her directly since Robert's funeral beyond a nod across a church parking lot. He does not ask how she is. He asks, in a tone already halfway to accusation, whether she is aware that her land has become, in his words, a monkey circus, and whether she intends to do something about it before the animals start getting into people's feed stores and gardens. She tells him, carefully, that she only discovered them herself an hour ago. It does not soften his voice. By the time she sets the receiver back in its cradle, she understands 2 things with equal clarity. The first is that Del Ashby did not call to check on her welfare. The second is that if Del already knows, by nightfall the whole valley will. She is right on both counts. Through the morning, more calls come, fewer of them directed at her and more of them, she suspects from the tone of the 2 she does answer, aimed past her, at whoever in the county government exists to be called about a situation like this one. By early afternoon, a white pickup with a county seal on the door turns off the main road and works its way up her long gravel drive, moving slowly, the way a vehicle moves when its driver is taking careful stock of what he is about to walk into. The man who steps out is compact and precise in a way that seems to extend to every part of him. From the crease ironed into his khaki uniform trousers to the clipboard he carries against his forearm like a shield. Harlan Voss has served as the county's environmental and health compliance officer for 11 years, long enough to have developed a professional posture that treats every unusual situation as, first and foremost, a liability waiting to be documented. He stands at the edge of the drive for a long moment, taking in the fence line, the roof of the barn, the animals watching him with the same unhurried stillness they showed Alistair at dawn, before he says anything at all. When he does speak, it is not to her directly, not yet. It is to the clipboard, in the low murmur of a man narrating for his own notes. Wildlife concentration, structural risk, and something that sounds like the word rabies, though he does not commit to it fully. Alistair comes down off the porch to meet him partway across the yard, and he looks up at her approach with an expression that is already decided before a single question has been asked, roughly what kind of conversation this is going to be. He tells her, in the flattened cadence of a man reading from a form he has filled out many times before, that a concentration of wild primates on residential property constitutes an immediate public health concern, particularly given the proximity to neighboring livestock and the unknown disease status of an animal population with no documented origin. He tells her that under county code, she has 72 hours to have the animals removed by a licensed wildlife control operator at her own expense, or the property will be subject to a civil penalty severe enough. He notes without quite meeting her eyes when he says the number, that it would very likely exceed what the land itself is worth. Alistair listens to all of it without interrupting, her arms folded against a chill that has nothing to do with the morning air. When he finishes, she asks him, in a voice that has not raised itself in a long time, who exactly filed the complaint that brought him out here so quickly. Harlan's pen pauses over the clipboard just long enough to answer the question without answering it, and he tells her only that concerns were raised by, in his phrasing, several parties within the agricultural community. Before he turns back toward his truck, tears a carbon copy of the notice free, and hands it to her the way a man hands over something he does not particularly want to be holding either. He is halfway back to the driver's door when he stops, looks once more at the fence line crowded with small watchful shapes, and says, almost to himself, that in 11 years he has never seen anything quite like this. It is the only thing he says all day that sounds less like policy and more like the truth. The truck pulls away down the gravel drive, and Alistair stands alone in her own yard holding a folded notice that gives her 3 days to either destroy or lose the strange, silent congregation that arrived on her land in the middle of a storm. Behind her, near the paddock fence, the old gray-browed male watches the retreating truck with an intensity that, for just a moment, looks less like an animal's instinct and more like understanding. The 72 hours do not arrive with any single dramatic event. They arrive the way real deadlines usually do, in a slow accumulation of small pressures that each seems survivable alone and become suffocating only in combination. Alistair spends the first day making phone calls that go nowhere, first to the county extension office, then to a wildlife rehabilitation hotline 2 hours away that puts her on hold long enough for the battery in the cordless phone to die, then to a university biology department where a graduate student takes detailed notes and promises a callback that does not come before nightfall. What she learns, in fragments, over that first day, comes together into a shape she does not like. The species is almost certainly tufted capuchin, native to South America, with no wild population anywhere near Virginia, which means this troop did not migrate here in any natural sense. It means someone, somewhere, kept them, likely for entertainment or breeding, likely in conditions bad enough that when circumstances forced a release or an escape, the animals scattered into the nearest unclaimed wilderness they could find and began, with whatever instinct survives captivity, searching for something that resembled safety. The logging operation on the ridge to the north offers the rest of the answer without anyone needing to say it aloud. 2 summers of clear cutting has been steadily erasing whatever patch of forest the animals had been surviving in since their release, pushing them lower and lower into the hollow, until a stewed apple and a heel of bread offered by a woman who did not know what she was starting became, to 100 displaced animals watching from whatever cover remained, the first sign in a long time that this particular direction might lead somewhere survivable. Alistair sits with that understanding on the second night. At the kitchen table, the county notice unfolded in front of her under the lamplight, and does not immediately know what to do with it. It would be easier, in almost every practical sense, to let the notice do its work. A wildlife control company would come, and however that process actually unfolds, in language the notice carefully avoids specifying, it would end with an empty fence line and a farm quietly returned to the state of manageable neglect she has maintained for 3 years. She would keep her land. She would keep, at the very least, the appearance of a life still being lived. She does not sleep well that night either, and near 2 in the morning, restless in a way sitting still cannot fix, she pulls on her coat and steps out onto the porch, half expecting the yard to be empty, half hoping it will be, so the decision could be made for her. It is not empty. Under a clear sky scattered with more stars than the valley usually shows through its haze of distant floodlights, the fence line and the barn roof and the low oak branches are still crowded with the same still, patient shapes, dozens of pairs of eyes catching what light there is, waiting, the way anything waits when it has already learned that waiting is often the only power it has left. Near the paddock rail, Zephyr stands with his head lowered toward the fence, and the old gray-browed male sits close enough to nearly touch him, motionless, keeping a kind of company that Alistair has not managed to offer her husband's horse in 3 long years. She watches the two of them for a long time in the dark, an old, grieving animal and 100 displaced strangers who arrived in a storm, and something in her chest that has been carefully, deliberately kept still since March 3 years ago moves, just slightly, out of place. She does not decide anything that night, not out loud, not even fully to herself. But when she goes back inside, she does not put the county notice away in a drawer to be dealt with later. She sets it on the kitchen table where she will see it first thing in the morning, and for the first time in longer than she can measure, she falls asleep without needing to check the window twice. The third morning, Alistair does not call the wildlife control number listed on the county notice. Instead, she drives the truck she has not started in 2 months into town, the engine turning over reluctant and rough, and parks outside the small brick building that houses the county clerk's office, a place she has not entered since filing Robert's death certificate. The woman behind the counter, a stranger young enough to have been one of Alistair's students without either of them realizing it, looks up a form neither of them has processed before, something called a private ecological sanctuary designation, buried deep enough in state statute that it takes 2 phone calls to a regional office before anyone can confirm it still legally exists. What it requires, once explained, is not simple. A licensed wildlife veterinarian's assessment, a land use survey establishing clear boundaries, a filing fee that consumes a significant portion of what remains in the modest savings account Robert left behind, money Alistair had privately, silently earmarked for whatever version of old age she assumed she would eventually have to face alone in a smaller house, in town, closer to a hospital. Spending it now, on paperwork whose outcome no one can guarantee, feels less like a plan and more like a leap made with her eyes open, fully aware there may be no ground on the other side. She files anyway. She drives home with the receipt folded in her coat pocket and does not tell Del Ashby, or the church women who stopped calling 2 winters ago, or her cousin in Roanoke, who would only worry in a way that helps no one. The word reaches them regardless, the way words always do in a valley this small, and within days the shift in how people speak of her becomes audible even from a distance, in the particular hush that falls over the feed store when she walks in, in the phrase she overhears once, not meant for her ears, but not quiet enough either, the crazy widow and her monkeys. She keeps working through it, setting out feed troughs modified from old cattle equipment, learning, through trial and long patient observation, which fruits the troop favors and which they leave untouched. Watching, day by day, as something in Zephyr's posture continues to change, his head coming up faster at the sound of her boots on the porch steps, his appetite returning enough that the grain bucket she fills each morning comes back empty by evening for the first time in longer than she can recall. The most striking change arrives on a quiet afternoon nearly a week in, when Alistair, crossing toward the barn with an armful of hay, stops at the paddock fence and does not immediately continue. Several of the younger Capuchins have worked their way along the rail to where Zephyr stands, and one by one, with a careful, deliberate patience that looks almost ceremonial, they begin working their small hands through his mane, parting the tangled black hair, picking free the burrs and the matted knots that Alistair has not had the strength or the will to properly groom out in 3 years. Zephyr stands utterly still for it, ears relaxed, eyes half closed, in a posture of trust she has not seen from him since before the wrench fell from Robert's hand in the equipment shed. She stands at the fence with the hay forgotten in her arms and watches 2 forms of grief that have never met before finding, without any human instruction, a shape of comfort neither one had access to alone. The sanctuary application is still pending review when the second visit arrives, and this one does not come from a single truck with a county seal on the door. It is late afternoon on the 9th day when 3 vehicles turn off the main road together, moving in a loose, deliberate convoy up her gravel drive, kicking dust that hangs gold in the low sun behind them. Alistair recognizes the lead truck before she recognizes the man stepping out of it, a newer model than anything else on this stretch of road. Its paint the deep green of a company that has done well enough to afford vehicles nobody strictly needs. Grady Pruitt owns, at last public count, 1,100 acres of soy and corn along the eastern side of the valley, land assembled over 2 decades through purchases that neighbors describe, depending on how much they trust him, either as opportunity or as opportunism. He does not come alone. Behind him, Del Ashby climbs out of the second truck, along with two other men Alistair recognizes from church, back when she still attended, and a woman with a folder under her arm who introduces herself briskly as county council liaison before Grady has finished his own introduction, a redundancy that seems to irritate him slightly, though he covers it with the easy smile of a man used to being the one who leads a conversation regardless of who else is talking. He is polite in the specific way of a man who has learned that politeness closes more deals than pressure does. He tells Alistair he came out of neighborly concern, that the county notice has apparently expired without compliance, that a group of local landowners, himself included, would like to make a fair offer for her parcel before the fines and legal complications compound any further. An offer, he says, generous enough to let her retire comfortably, somewhere quieter, somewhere without this particular headache attached to it. Alistair asks him, evenly, what he intends to do with the land once he owns it. Grady's smile does not move, but something behind his eyes recalibrates, and he tells her, in language carefully sanded down of anything that could be quoted back at him later, that the parcel would likely be cleared and incorporated into existing operations, that the wildlife situation would be handled properly, professionally, by people equipped to handle it, a phrasing that manages to describe extermination without ever using the word. Behind him, Del adds, less carefully, that the whole valley has had enough of the disruption, the noise, the risk of disease, and that most of the neighbors, whatever they say to Alistair's face, would be relieved to see the property change hands into something more sensible than 100 monkeys and one stubborn old woman refusing to let go. The fence line behind them, Alistair notices without turning her head fully to look, has gone very quiet. A dozen shapes along the rail have stilled into the particular alertness of animals reading tension in a group of strangers, and near the paddock, Zephyr's head has come up sharp, ears pinned toward the visitors in a way she has not seen from him in years. She tells Grady, in a voice that surprises her with how steady it manages to stay, that the land is not for sale, that the sanctuary filing is active, and that if he wants to discuss it further, he can do so through whatever office reviews her paperwork, because she has nothing further to discuss with him standing in her own driveway. It is not a long speech. It does not need to be. Grady's smile finally slips, just slightly, into something colder, and he tells her, before turning back toward his truck, that paperwork can be challenged, that the council has more influence over this valley than one widow's filing fee, and that she should think carefully about what she's choosing to protect, and what it might cost her to protect it. The convoy pulls away in the same order it arrived, and Alistair stands alone in the settling dust, the weight of the threat sitting differently in her chest than the county notice did, less bureaucratic, more personal, the sound of a door she thought might still open quietly being kicked instead. That night, she does not sleep at the table over paperwork. She sits on the porch steps in the dark, coat pulled tight, and watches the fence line settle back into its restless, watchful calm. Animal shapes shifting and resettling the way a crowd does after a scare has passed, but not fully faded. She thinks of the money already spent, the filing fee gone, the wildlife veterinarian's assessment still weeks from being scheduled, the land use survey she cannot yet afford to commission. She thinks of Grady's easy thread about influence, and how much truth likely sits underneath the confidence in his voice. She thinks, too, of the way Zephyr stood at that fence, ears up, protective, for the first time in 3 years standing like a horse that still has something worth guarding. Near midnight, the old gray-browed male makes his way down off the barn roof, crosses the wet grass with the unhurried gait of an animal who has decided, some time ago, that this particular human does not require caution, and settles at the base of the porch steps, close enough that Alistair could reach down and touch him if she chose to. She does not. She simply sits with him in the dark, two survivors of different catastrophes, neither one speaking a language the other fully understands, and somewhere in that shared silence, the decision that has been forming inside her for 9 days finally settles into something she no longer feels the need to argue herself out of. She is not selling. Whatever it costs to prove that this land can hold both grief and rescue at once, she intends to pay it. The following 2 weeks pass in a rhythm Alistair has not lived inside in a very long time. One shaped not by grief's slow erosion, but by deadlines, phone calls, and the particular exhaustion of a woman rebuilding something from very little material. She learns, through repeated calls to the regional wildlife office, that the veterinary assessment required for her sanctuary filing can be expedited, at additional cost, by a specialist willing to make the 4-hour drive out from Charlottesville. She learns that the land use survey, ordinarily a routine matter, has mysteriously found itself delayed twice at the county office, a coincidence that Harlan Voss, when she finally reaches him directly, neither confirms nor denies, though his silence on the subject says enough. She sells what she can. A set of Robert's tools she has kept boxed in the equipment shed since the funeral, untouched, unable until now to imagine parting with them. A second horse trailer that has sat and used since the cattle were sold. A ring that belonged to her mother, pawned quietly in a town 2 counties over where no one would recognize either the ring or the woman selling it. Each transaction chips something away from her that has nothing to do with money, and she does each one anyway, methodically, without allowing herself the indulgence of dwelling on the cost. The isolation deepens before it eases. The church women who once brought casseroles in the months after Robert's death now cross the street rather than pass close enough to speak. A letter arrives from the county council, and signed, warning in bureaucratic language of unspecified additional inspections to come. Del Ashby's wife, at the feed store one afternoon, says loudly enough to be overheard that some people would rather live with wild animals than with other human beings, and does not bother lowering her voice when Alistair walks past. Alistair absorbs each of these moments the way she has absorbed most things these past 3 years, quietly, without visible reaction, filing them away somewhere she does not examine too closely. But there is a difference now in how the silence of her house feels when she returns to it each evening. It is no longer empty. Through the kitchen window, the fence line holds its steady population of watchful shapes, and near the paddock, Zephyr has taken to meeting her at the gate each morning, head up, ears forward, waiting the way a working horse waits for a job that finally, again, has a purpose behind it. The veterinarian, when she finally arrives, spends the better part of a full day moving carefully among the troop, tranquilizer darts prepared but largely unused, since the animals prove far calmer under handling than any wild population reasonably should be, a detail she notes with visible surprise in her official report. Her assessment, delivered to Alistair on the porch steps at dusk that evening, comes with cautious optimism. No signs of rabies. No indication of disease transmissible to livestock. A population healthy enough, structurally sound enough as a troop, to qualify, on medical grounds at least, for sanctuary status, provided the remaining paperwork clears in time. It is the closest thing to good news Alistair has received in weeks, and she allows herself, alone on the porch after the veterinarian's truck disappears down the drive, a single unguarded breath of something that might, cautiously, be called relief. It does not last the length of that breath. 2 days later, the survey team finally arrives, escorted, unexpectedly, by Grady Pruitt himself, along with a private land attorney Alistair does not recognize, and Harlan Voss trailing a step behind them both with the careful posture of a man who did not choose to be part of whatever is about to unfold. The stated purpose is routine, an official measurement of the property's legal boundaries as required for the sanctuary filing. What happens instead, over the course of that long afternoon, is nothing routine at all. The survey crew works methodically along the eastern boundary line, the property edge that runs closest to Grady's own land, and it is there, roughly 2 hours into the work, that one of the younger Capuchins, digging at the base of an old fence post with the idle curiosity of an animal exploring new ground, unearths something buried deep enough that decades of undisturbed soil have kept it hidden. A corroded metal marker, the kind used to establish official land boundaries generations ago, its stamped numbers still faintly legible beneath the rust. Then another animal, working a different section of fence line 30 yards further along, digs up a second marker. Then a third. Alistair, watching from a distance with her arms folded, notices before anyone else does what the survey crew is only beginning to piece together, that the markers are emerging in a straight, consistent line, and that the line they trace sits well inside the fence Grady Pruitt has treated as his property boundary for the better part of a decade. The land attorney's expression shifts first, a controlled but unmistakable tightening around his mouth as he crouches to examine the third marker himself. Grady's reaction takes longer to surface, and when it does, it arrives not as anger but as a stillness that reads, to anyone paying close enough attention, as considerably more dangerous. He says nothing for a long moment, staring at the small dark animal sitting placidly beside the marker it just uncovered, as though the creature itself has personally wronged him. Harlan Voss, crouched beside the survey engineer comparing the newly exposed marker against an old plat map pulled from his truck, says quietly, mostly to himself, that if these markers are original and undisturbed, then several acres currently under active cultivation on the Pruitt side of the fence have been sitting, for years, on land that was never legally his to plant. The silence that follows stretches long enough that even the animals along the fence line seem to sense its weight. Dozens of small shapes gone still and watchful, the way they went still the day Grady's convoy first arrived. Alistair does not say anything. She does not need to. The ground itself, quite literally, has just spoken for her, unearthed not by her own hands, not by any lawyer she could afford, but by the very animals Grady Pruitt has spent 2 weeks trying to have declared a public menace. He turns to look at her across the disturbed grass, and whatever composure has carried him through every previous conversation between them finally, visibly, cracks. Grady does not raise his voice. That, Alistair will think later, is what makes the moment land as hard as it does, the absence of shouting where shouting would have been easier to dismiss. He stands over the third marker with his jaw working, looking not at the rusted metal, but at the animal seated calmly beside it, as though the creature has committed a personal insult rather than an accident of instinct and idle digging. When he finally speaks, it is to the land attorney, not to Alistair, his voice low and clipped, instructing the man to get the survey stopped immediately, to have the markers photographed and removed for independent verification before, he says, this gets exaggerated into something it isn't. Harlan Voss straightens from his crouch and says, in the flat procedural tone of a man who has just realized his own job now requires him to document something considerably larger than a nuisance complaint, that county surveys, once witnessed by a licensed engineer, cannot simply be undone because one party finds the results inconvenient. The engineer, a quiet younger man who has said almost nothing all afternoon, nods once and continues photographing the markers exactly where they lie. Grady's attention swings back to Alistair, and for the first time since his convoy first rolled up her drive, the easy salesman's warmth is entirely gone from his face. He tells her that this changes nothing, that she is still a woman alone on a failing piece of land surrounded by animals nobody in this county actually wants, and that markers in the dirt do not put food on her table or pay the fines still technically active against her property. Alistair does not answer him directly. She looks instead at Del Ashby, standing a few paces back, who has gone very quiet, his earlier certainty about disruption and disease visibly complicated by what he just watched come out of the ground. The survey crew finishes documenting the boundary discrepancy before dusk, and Grady's trucks leave the property in a considerably less confident convoy than the one that arrived. Harlan lingers a moment longer than the others, standing near his own vehicle with the old plat map still in hand, and tells Alistair, in a voice stripped of its earlier bureaucratic distance, that he will need to file an amended report, one that documents both the boundary findings and, he adds, glancing once toward the fence line still crowded with watchful shapes, his professional observation that he has never in 11 years seen an animal population behave with this degree of calm around. This much human conflict. It is not an apology. It is not quite an alliance either. But it is, Alistair understands as his truck disappears down the drive, the first official document that will exist, on record, describing what has happened on her land as something other than a public health emergency. That night, for the first time in nearly 3 weeks, she sleeps without the county notice, without Grady's threats, without the weight of the filing fee sitting on her chest like a stone. She sleeps, instead, with the sound of 100 quiet bodies settled across her fence line and her barn roof, and Zephyr's occasional low sound carrying faint through the open window, and wakes the next morning to a version of silence she has not experienced in 3 years, one that no longer feels like something taken from her, but like something she has, against every reasonable expectation, chosen to keep. The reprieve does not last. 9 days after the boundary markers surface, a certified letter arrives, forwarded through the county office, informing Alastair that the sanctuary application has been formally challenged, not on the grounds of animal welfare or public health, both of which the veterinary assessment and Harlan's amended report have by now thoroughly addressed, but on a narrower, more surgical technicality buried in the state statute itself, a requirement that the applicant demonstrate uncontested legal title to the entire parcel being designated, a requirement rendered suddenly, conveniently unmet by the very boundary dispute the monkeys themselves uncovered. Alastair reads the letter twice at the kitchen table, understanding slowly what it actually means. Grady Pruitt's legal team, unable to simply buy her out or have the animals removed as pests, has found a different route entirely, weaponizing the disputed boundary against her, arguing that until ownership of the contested acreage is formally resolved in court, a process that could take months, possibly longer, her entire sanctuary filing must remain frozen. Frozen filing means no legal protection. No legal protection means the original county notice, technically still unresolved, could be reactivated at any moment, and this time, with Grady's influence behind it, enforced without mercy. She sits with the letter until the light outside the window shifts from afternoon gold to evening gray and does not move to turn on a lamp. The math is simple and merciless. A legal challenge means an attorney she cannot afford, retained against a man with resources she will never match, over a timeline she does not have, since the animals still occupying her fence line remain, in the eyes of the county, only as protected as the frozen paperwork sitting in a drawer somewhere in Richmond. It would be easier, she understands with a clarity that frightens her, to fold now. To call Grady's attorney directly and accept whatever diminished offer remains on the table, to take what money is left, to move into town, to let the animals scatter back into whatever remains of the forest they came from, or worse, to let the county's original removal order finally run its course. No one would blame her for it. Del Ashby's wife would likely say, within earshot, that she finally came to her senses. She thinks of the old gray-browed male on the porch that first storm-soaked night, arm curled against his own ribs, choosing to stay in the light rather than vanish back into the dark. She thinks of Zephyr's ears coming up sharp at the sound of Grady's trucks, standing guard for the first time in years over something worth guarding. She thinks of Robert and the particular stubbornness he carried about this land, a stubbornness she used to find exhausting when he was alive and has come, in his absence, to understand rather differently. The decision she reaches that night is not loud. It does not arrive with any dramatic declaration spoken aloud into the empty kitchen. It arrives instead the way most real decisions do, in the quiet, exhausted certainty of a woman folding the certified letter back along its original creases, setting it beside the sanctuary paperwork rather than in the drawer where easier decisions get buried, and picking up the phone to call the one number she has been avoiding for 2 weeks. A legal aid clinic in Charlottesville that handles land disputes for people who cannot otherwise afford representation. She does not sleep that night either. But when dawn comes, gray and quiet over a fence line still holding its watchful, patient population, she is already dressed, already at the kitchen table, already writing out, by hand, in the careful cursive she once used to grade 26 years of biology exams. Everything she remembers Robert ever telling her about where their land actually ended and Grady Pruitt's began. The legal aid attorney who eventually takes her case, a tired, sharp-eyed woman named Corinne who drives out from Charlottesville twice over the following month, warns Alastair early and often that boundary disputes involving decades-old markers and contested plat records rarely move quickly and almost never move cheaply, even with representation provided at reduced cost. The county court sets a preliminary hearing date 6 weeks out, a timeline that stretches the sanctuary filing's frozen status uncomfortably close to the original removal notice's dormant deadline, close enough that Corinne does not pretend the outcome is anything close to guaranteed. Alastair spends those 6 weeks the way she has spent every difficult stretch of her life since Robert died, by working, because working is the only medicine she has ever fully trusted. She reinforces sections of fence that Grady's crew trampled during the survey. She negotiates, with money she does not entirely have, a reduced rate from a local feed supplier willing to deliver produce past its market date, food still good enough for the troop though no longer sellable at the grocery outlets in town. She learns, slowly, the individual temperaments of animals she once could only see as an undifferentiated crowd along her fence line. A younger female who startles at sudden movement, a pair of juveniles who have taken to sleeping curled against Zephyr's flank on cold nights, the gray-browed old male, whom she has, without quite deciding to, begun privately calling by a name. The valley's opinion of her does not soften during this stretch, but it does begin, in small, unpredictable ways, to fracture. Harlan Voss stops by twice, unofficially, driving his own truck rather than the county vehicle. Once to drop off a printed copy of an old aerial survey he found in the archive that supports the marker placement. Once simply to stand at the fence for 20 minutes in silence, watching the troop groom Zephyr's mane, before saying, almost to himself, that he has started to understand why she won't let this go. Even Del Ashby's wife, encountered again at the feed store, says nothing loud this time, only glances at Alistair a moment longer than necessary before looking away, an expression harder to read than open hostility. The hearing itself, when it finally arrives, takes place in a modest county courtroom that smells faintly of floor polish and old paper, and lasts less than a single afternoon. Corinne presents the surveyed markers, the engineer's photographs, the amended report Harlan Voss filed under his own signature. Grady's attorney argues, with less conviction than the earlier threats suggested he would carry, that the marker's provenance remains uncertain, that soil disturbance from wildlife could theoretically compromise their positioning. The judge, an older woman with little patience for arguments unsupported by documentation, asks only one direct question of Grady himself, whether he can produce any prior survey of his own predating the one just completed. He cannot. The ruling does not come that same day. It arrives 11 days later, by mail, in language dense enough that Alistair has to read it twice before Corinne's follow-up call confirms what it actually means. The original boundary markers are recognized as valid. The disputed acreage reverts to Alistair's title. The sanctuary application, no longer obstructed by contested ownership, is cleared to proceed to final review. Alistair reads the letter standing at her own kitchen counter, the same counter where she washed a single plate 3 months earlier on the night this all began, and does not immediately celebrate. She sets the letter down, walks out onto the porch, and stands there for a long time simply looking at the fence line, the animals along the rail, Zephyr grazing steady in the afternoon light, absorbing the news the way she has learned to absorb everything now, quietly, before allowing herself to fully believe it. It is not quite over. The sanctuary status is not finalized, not yet, and Grady Pruitt, she suspects, is not a man inclined to lose gracefully. But for the first time since the morning she found her fence line filled with 100 silent strangers, Alistair Whitfield stands on her own porch with land that is, unambiguously, undeniably, still hers. The final sanctuary review takes place on a cool morning in early autumn, nearly 5 months after the storm that first brought an injured animal to her porch. A small state delegation arrives, 2 wildlife officials and a junior attorney, walking the property with clipboards considerably kinder than Harlan Voss's first visit, noting the constructed feed stations, the reinforced fencing, the veterinary records Alistair has kept meticulously updated through every difficult week of the summer. They spend more time watching than measuring, standing at the paddock fence for a long stretch, taking in the sight of small dark hands working carefully through a black horse's mane while he stands utterly still for it, eyes half closed, in a posture no one in this valley has managed to coax out of him in years. The approval, when it finally comes through in writing, arrives without fanfare. A single certified envelope Alistair opens at the same kitchen table where she once read the county's original removal notice with her hands shaking. This time her hands are steady. The land is designated, formally, permanently, as a private ecological sanctuary, protected under state statute from the kind of removal order that once gave her 72 hours to destroy everything gathered on her fence line, protected, in effect, from Grady Pruitt and every future version of Grady Pruitt who might come looking to clear this hollow for something more profitable than a widow and her 100 strange guests. Grady does not come to the farm again. Word reaches Alistair eventually, the way word always does in a valley this small, that the logging contract on the ridge above Miller's Gap has quietly stalled, tangled now in its own scrutiny after county officials, following the boundary dispute, began looking more closely at the permits behind the clear-cutting that pushed the troop out of the forest in the first place. It is not justice in any complete sense. The trees already cut do not grow back overnight. But the cutting that remains scheduled does not go forward either, and somewhere in that quiet halt, Alistair recognizes something that feels, if not like victory, at least like consequence finally landing where it belongs. She keeps the fence line the animals first claimed, though it no longer needs to hold them against a county notice. Some of the younger Capuchins have begun venturing further afield during the day, into the tree line at the property's edge, returning most evenings to the barn roof and the fence rail out of what looks less like necessity now and more like habit, or something close enough to home that leaving fully no longer holds much appeal. The gray-browed old male stays closest of all, spending most days now within sight of Zephyr's paddock, and Alistair, watching the two of them from the porch some evenings, has stopped pretending the sight doesn't undo something tight in her chest each time she sees it. Zephyr has not fully returned to the horse he was before Robert died. Some absences do not close, no matter what fills the space around them. But he grazes with an appetite she has not seen in 3 years, and meets her at the gate each morning with his ears forward. And on the coldest nights, when frost creeps early across the valley floor, more than one small dark shape can be found curled against his flank, drawing warmth from an animal who, not so long ago, seemed to be waiting only for permission to stop trying. Alistair still keeps to herself more than most people in the valley would consider ordinary. The church women have not fully forgiven her strangeness, and likely never fully will. Del Ashby still keeps a careful distance at the feed store, though he no longer speaks of monkey circuses within her hearing. But something in how the valley regards her has shifted regardless, a grudging recalibration visible in small gestures, a nod held a beat longer than it used to be, away from a truck that once would have driven past without acknowledgement. On a clear evening in late October, with the light going long in gold across the fields the way it always does this time of year in this particular hollow, Alistair walks out to the paddock fenced the way she has walked out most evenings for months now, and finds Zephyr waiting at the rail, and the old gray-browed male seated on the fence post beside him, and a scattering of others settling into the branches overhead as dusk gathers. She does not think, standing there, that she saved anything. The thought that surfaces instead, unbidden and unexamined the way her thoughts rarely allow themselves to be anymore, is closer to the opposite. Whatever arrived on her porch in that storm 5 months ago did not come looking for rescue. It came looking for shelter, the way anything displaced eventually looks for shelter, and in providing it, without ever quite deciding to, she stopped disappearing into the particular kind of quiet that had been swallowing her, one careful, guarded day at a time, since the morning she found a cold cup of coffee beside a still hand in the equipment shed. She reaches out, finally, and rests her hand against the old horse's neck, and beside her, close enough now that the distance no longer feels like anything either of them is guarding against. The animal she once fed a single stewed apple on a night neither of them expected to survive settles into the fence post and does not move away. The valley goes quiet around them the way it always does at dusk, wind settling low over the grass, the last birds finding their branches, the mountain beyond the ridge fading into a deepening blue. It is not the silence Alistair lived inside for 3 years, the one that felt like being forgotten. This silence holds weight now, holds company, holds the particular kind of peace that only arrives after everything worth fighting for has, against every reasonable expectation, been allowed to stay. If a story about an old widow, a wounded animal, and the 100 strangers who followed him home moved something in you tonight, that is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Somewhere out there, someone else is standing on their own quiet porch, wondering if it is too late to open the door. If Alistair's choice reminded you that it usually isn't, tell us where you are watching from in the comments. And if you want more stories like hers, make sure you are subscribed, because the next one is already waiting in the dark for someone kind enough to notice it.